Rio and Chevy.
If only. If only nuclear war was just another kind of war. But it isn't. If there is a nuclear war, our foes will not be China or America or even each other. Our foe will be the Earth herself. Our cities and forests, our fields and villages will burn for days. Rivers will turn to poison. The air will become fire. The wind will spread the flames. When everything there is to burn has burnt and the fires die, smoke will rise and shut out the sun. Nuclear winter will set in. Then, what shall we eat? What shall we drink? What shall we breathe?
This is the story of the biggest weapons of mass destruction ever created. It is about the people who use them. More importantly, it is about the people who fight them.
We shall become the next species that become extinct, and I don't want that to happen. I've got 10 grandchildren, and I want them to live.
Humanity is engaged in a race against time because its moral advance hasn't kept up with the advancing technology, and it could destroy itself.
In 1941, competing against a project in Nazi Germany, the US begins its atom bomb program, the Manhattan Project. In 1945, the US becomes the first country to detonate a nuclear bomb. Humankind enters the atomic age. The experiment moves from test site to the real world, with devastating impact. The temperature near the epicenter reaches over 4,000 degrees centigrade. Everything is vaporized. All that's left are shadows burnt into the ground, carbon remnants of what had once been human. A mile out from the epicenter, bodies ignite spontaneously. Further away still, people looking at the fireball are instantly blinded.
I looked at the road before me, denuded, burnt and bloody. Numberless survivors stood in my path. They were massed together, some crawling on their knees or on all fours, Some stood with difficulty or leant on another's shoulder. No one showed any sign that forced me to recognize him or her as a human being. I believe it was about a week after the bombing that an unexpected event happened. The survivors seemed to fall ill in groups of 7 or 8. The same groups appeared to die together. At the time, as physicians, we could not know that our patients were dying because of an atomic bomb, which could kill them long after the blast.
3 days later, Nagasaki is hit by an even more powerful bomb. 40,000 deaths occur immediately, although the bomb detonates off target. Further from the epicenter, human beings, burnt and parched, pray for rain and relief. Black, radioactive rain falls. Its effects will plague the survivors for decades to come, in the shape of birth deformities and cancers.
The combination of a massive fireball, a hurricane-force wind, and massive amounts of radiation released into the atmosphere. I mean, if you really think about burning skin and irradiated organs, it's a horrible way to go. And sometimes it's a very horrible way to survive. You get the long-term effects of irradiated organs, i.e. cancers, going on for 60 years and more. We're still getting new data out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
I did go to Hiroshima. The thing that I remember most of all was a little mark on the pavement. And I said, what was that? And they said, oh, that was where a child was sitting, and it was completely vaporized by the bomb. And next to the mark was a metal lunchbox that had been twisted by the heat beside the mark that was a child. And if ever there was a war crime, it's that.
It is still widely believed that the bombing of Japan was necessary to bring the war to an end and save American lives. But now there is a growing consensus that Japan's surrender was imminent and the bombing was not necessary.
I read it in the papers and I heard it in the wireless. The propaganda that it was needed to defeat Japan was believed very widely. I believed it at the time. Its real significance didn't dawn on me.
The real purpose of dropping the bomb was to tell the Russians that America had a weapon of supreme power.
The whole thing was done to frighten the Soviet Union.
The Cold War began at Hiroshima. That's when it began.
The Soviet Union was emerging at that time as a great victorious power. It had been responsible for the defeat of the Nazi forces in Eastern Europe and, of course, Western Europe too, in alliance with the United States. And the United States wanted to make it very clear that it was going to be the dominant power in the post-war period.
General Groves, he was the head of the whole Manhattan Project. From time to time, he would come to Los Alamos. I remember once, early 1944, when Groves suddenly said to Chadwick, you realize, of course, that all our work we're making the bomb is against the Russians, so we have to be ready against them. Now, to me, this came as a terrible shock. I never got really over it.
The end of the war doesn't bring peace. It brings another kind of war.